The rain didn't stop that morning. It came down steady and cold, the kind that makes silence louder. Harold Bennett's funeral was supposed to be a family moment, but my husband treated it like a corporate event. Daniel stood near the casket in his navy suit, shaking hands, giving polite smiles to business partners who saw his father's death as a networking opportunity. I stood off to the side, next to a vase of white lilies that were already starting to wilt. I'd been up all night ironing his shirt, setting the table for the wake, and making sure Harold's picture didn't look like a resume photo. Daniel hadn't noticed any of that. What I did notice was Madison Cole, his assistant. She was in black, but her heels were too high, her perfume too sweet, and her hand rested on his arm like they shared a secret. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to say a few words, I waited for Daniel. He looked around, checked his watch, and whispered something to Madison instead. No one spoke. Harold had been a tough man, but a good one. I'd spent a year taking care of him, cleaning, feeding, reading to him when he forgot names and dates. Daniel visited twice, maybe 3 times, always with Madison tagging along, saying things like, "He's not even aware anymore," or, "You're doing more than necessary." So I stood up. Not because I wanted to, but because someone had to. I said, Harold Bennett wasn't perfect, but he built something real. He worked hard, trusted deeply, and never forgot where he came from. My voice shook, not from nerves but from the sound of my own truth, bouncing off a room full of people who had already moved on. Daniel didn't look at me. He was busy nodding to the head of marketing. After the service, guests drifted away. I stayed to help the staff clean up. Daniel came over only when the last car left. "You don't need to stay here anymore," he said flatly. "I know," I answered, stacking the leftover programs into a box. "But someone should make sure he's treated better in death than he was at the end." He sighed, annoyed. "Claire, please. You're making this dramatic." I turned to him. "You didn't even speak today." He shrugged. "What's left to say?" Madison appeared behind him, holding his phone. "Daniel, they're waiting for us at the reception," she said, smiling politely at me like I was the help. I nodded, said nothing, and watched them leave together. When the doors closed, I sat down in the front pew. For the first time since Harold died, the reality hit. I wasn't just mourning him. I was mourning the last version of my marriage that had any meaning. That night, at the reception in the Bennett mansion, I noticed something. Daniel laughed too much. Madison hovered close. Their conversation with Harold's business partners looked less like grief and more like a victory tour. Later, I overheard one of them ask Daniel, "So, what happens now? Who's running the company?" Daniel smiled, raising his glass. "I am." I walked out into the rain before anyone noticed. The champagne on my tongue had turned bitter. On the drive home, I replayed Harold's last words to me, the night before he passed. "You'll see their true faces when I'm gone. But don't fight them with anger, Claire. Use time. Use truth." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Sitting in the dark parking lot that night, I started to. Daniel came home around midnight. He smelled like whiskey and victory. "Good speech today," he said, tossing his tie onto the couch. "Next time, maybe keep it shorter." "There won't be a next time," I said quietly. He looked at me like I was speaking another language. "You're exhausted. Take a break from all this sadness." "Alming." "I'm fine," I replied. He kissed my cheek like you do a stranger at a dinner party, and walked off to his office. The printer in the next room hummed. I heard Madison's name come through on his phone. He didn't bother hiding it anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my reflection in the window. The woman staring back looked calm, too calm. That's how betrayal feels when it finally stops surprising you. The next morning, Daniel handed me a folder of financial documents. "You'll need to sign these for the estate transfer," he said. "Estate transfer?" "Just routine paperwork. Dad's assets need reallocation." I flipped through the pages, saw Harold's company letterhead, and something labeled Caregiver Acknowledgement Clause. I asked what it meant. Daniel barely looked up. "It's just a formality." I signed it. When he left for the office, I sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the rain streaks on the glass. Everything about that day felt too quiet, too controlled like a movie scene before something breaks. Before we go on, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever watched someone pretend to grieve just to protect their image? It's strange how some people cry for attention, not for loss. And if you like true cheating stories, revenge stories, and real husband betrayal that end in justice, make sure to subscribe. Because what happened after that funeral didn't just change my marriage, it changed everything. The rain finally stopped that night, but the silence between us never did. The morning after the funeral, the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels intentional, like someone erased the noise on purpose. Daniel left early, saying he had meetings downtown. I didn't ask who they were with. The air in Harold's old home still smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. His bedroom door was closed, the hallway dim. For months, this place had been alive with the sound of monitors, oxygen tanks, and his rough laughter when I read him the paper. Now, it was just silence and dust settling over the life he left behind. I spent the morning packing up his things carefully, folding shirts, labeling boxes, avoiding the sound of my own thoughts. When I opened his nightstand drawer, I found a small notepad filled with shaky handwriting. On the last page, he had written only one sentence: "She stayed." I sat there for a long time. By noon, I made myself coffee, the kind Harold liked, strong enough to taste like regret. On the kitchen counter lay the folder Daniel had asked me to sign. The title read, Estate Transition Agreement. I scanned the pages again, now slower. Halfway through, I spotted a line I hadn't noticed before. Caregiver Acknowledgement Clause. It was written in dense legal language, the kind Daniel loved to wave around to sound intelligent. Something about transfer of estate management and designated caretaker. It didn't make sense then, but I underlined it in pencil and left the folder on the table. I turned on the news just for the company. A reporter was talking about Bennett and Sons developments, showing clips of Daniel shaking hands at the funeral reception. The caption below his photo read, "New CEO carries father's legacy forward." I shut off the TV. Around 3 p.m., I heard a car door outside. When I looked out the window, Daniel's sedan was parked near the gate. Madison stepped out first, adjusting her sunglasses. She looked around like she was visiting a zoo enclosure she didn't want to touch. Daniel followed behind her, holding a clipboard. I didn't go out to greet them. I just watched as they stood near the front porch. Madison pointed at the overgrown hedges and made a face. Daniel laughed. When they finally came in, Madison wrinkled her nose. "Still smells like hospital in here." Daniel ignored the comment and turned to me. "We'll need to list this place soon. Dad's company can't afford to maintain unused property." I said quietly. He loved this house. Daniel gave me that corporate smile he used for boardrooms. "And now it'll give someone else a chance to love it." Odd. Madison chimed in. "Maybe a family who doesn't need constant supervision." She laughed softly at her own joke. I didn't respond. I just took the folder from the table and handed it to Daniel. "Here. The papers you wanted." He looked surprised. "You signed them?" "Yes." "Good," he said, slipping it into his briefcase. "It's easier when we handle things like adults." When they left, the sound of their car engine lingered longer than their presence. That night, I sat on the couch, scrolling through photos on my phone. There were pictures of Harold and me in the garden last spring, him smiling, dirt under his nails, saying, "Don't tell Daniel I still plant things myself." In another photo, he was holding a model of the company's first building. I looked at those photos until my eyes blurred. Then I opened my laptop. Daniel's social media page loaded instantly, a post from that afternoon. A photo of him and Madison standing outside the company headquarters. The caption read, "New chapter begins, honoring my father's vision. Excited for the future." The comments were full of congratulations. Not one mention of Harold. Not one mention of family. I closed the laptop and stared at the reflection in the black screen. When the clock hit midnight, the lights flickered once the way they always did in this old house, and I felt the weight of it. How easily people move on when money and power fill the space grief should occupy. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under the front door. No return address. Inside was a note in careful handwriting. "Mrs. Bennett, if you still have the box Mr. Harold left you, please bring it to my office. Alan Rhodes." Alan Rhodes. Harold's longtime lawyer. The name sent a pulse of something between curiosity and dread down my spine. I made coffee, put the envelope next to the notepad that said, "She stayed," and sat in silence again. But this time, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like the moment before a storm, when everything holds its breath. The day went on like any other. I cleaned, I packed, I waited. But every minute that passed made that house feel less like a tomb and more like a test one I didn't realize I'd already started taking. And as the sun set behind the trees Harold once planted, I finally opened the drawer under the coffee table, took out the small wooden box he'd given me before he died, and turned it in my hands. It was heavier than I remembered. When I lifted the lid, the faint smell of cedar filled the air, the same scent from Harold's study. Inside was a single sealed envelope, embossed with a law firm's crest. My name was written across the front in his handwriting. The same calm that used to keep me silent through Daniel's arrogance settled in again. But this time, it wasn't silence from fear. It was silence before understanding. Nothing in that house had changed. Not the furniture, not the peeling wallpaper, not even the air. But somehow, I knew everything was about to. The wooden box sat on my lap, like it was waiting for me to remember something I'd forgotten. The paper inside was sealed tight, stamped with Harold's law firm crest. My name written in his careful, fading handwriting, Claire Bennett. The sound of rain started again outside, slow and steady. It always rained when Harold had something to say. When I opened the envelope, I expected a will or maybe instructions about the house. Instead, I found a short letter written on thick stationery, dated 3 weeks before he passed. "Claire? I know you'll find this after I'm gone. If you're reading it, that means Daniel is already running the show or thinks he is. Don't fight him with anger. Fight him with patience. When the world stops clapping for him, you'll understand what I meant. There's a file in my study. Give it to Alan Rhodes. He'll know what to do. HB. Hem." I read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it back into the box. Harold never wasted words. His study was still the same as he left it, shelves of old books, framed photos of construction sites, the faint smell of pipe tobacco. I found the file exactly where he said it would be, tucked behind a photo of his first office. Inside were old contracts, company letters, and notes written in his hand. One line stood out. "Amendment pending, trust in Claire." That was the first time I let myself cry. Not the dramatic kind of crying people do in movies. The quiet kind, where you don't move, don't wipe your face, just let it happen. Harold had been more of a father to me than my own ever was. He used to joke that I was the only one in this family who knows what decency looks like. I thought he was exaggerating. Now I wasn't so sure. The memory of our last conversation came back to me so vividly, it almost felt like it was happening again. It was a late night in April. He was in his recliner, breathing heavy but still sharp. I had just finished making him soup. He looked at me and said, "Claire, you ever notice how people love you most when they need you?" I smiled, thinking he was joking. "You're just tired, Harold." "No," he said. "I'm observant." He reached for his glass of water and added, "Daniel's good with numbers, but blind to people. He sees worth only when it adds to his profit." I stayed quiet. He continued, "When I go, they'll circle like vultures. You'll see. Just remember, sometimes the right person doesn't have the right last name." He leaned back, watching me like he wanted to memorize my face. "You remind me of my wife," he said. "She cared for people, not appearances." He chuckled weakly. "If I had any sense, I'd leave the business to you instead of the boy who thinks Instagram followers equal integrity." I laughed then, just to lighten the air. "Don't joke like that. He's class." He smiled. "Who said I was joking?" That was the night he gave me the box. He tapped it once before handing it over. "Everything I couldn't say out loud is in there," he said. Back then, I thought it was sentiment. Now, I knew it was a plan. I walked back to the kitchen, made tea, and stared at the letter again. The words, Alan Rhodes, circled my thoughts like a drumbeat. Daniel called around 8 that night. "You at the house again?" he asked. His tone was casual, too casual. "Yes," I said. He sighed. "Claire, you've got to stop living in the past. Dad's gone. Madison and I are handling the business now. It's what he would have wanted. I smiled into the phone, though he couldn't see it. Did he tell you that himself? There was a pause. Don't start, Claire. This is hard for everyone. Of course, I said softly. Especially for you. Power's exhausting. He didn't get the joke. He never did. When the call ended, I opened my laptop again. I searched Alan Rhodes' Law Office, Raleigh, NC. His name appeared at the top, along with a photo of a man in his late 60s, gray hair, small smile. The address wasn't far. The next morning, I drove there. His office was tucked between a bakery and a pharmacy, nothing flashy, the kind of place you could walk past 100 times and never notice. Inside, everything smelled of paper and old coffee. A receptionist led me to his office. Alan Rhodes stood up when I entered. Mrs. Bennett, he said, shaking my hand warmly. Harold spoke of you often. Please, sit. I handed him the letter and the file. He read quietly for a few minutes, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up. He trusted you, he said simply. More than anyone. I didn't know what to say. Alan opened a cabinet, pulled out a thick folder, and set it on the desk. Harold made an amendment to his estate 6 weeks before he passed, he said. He didn't want to file it until he was sure. Alu. Sure of what? I asked. That you'd stay when everyone else left. He slid the folder toward me. In this amendment, Harold transferred controlling interest of Bennett and Sons developments to the person responsible for his personal care and estate during his final days. You. The room felt smaller suddenly. I didn't speak. Alan continued. Daniel doesn't know. He only saw the first draft. Harold made sure of it. He's Phoebe. I looked down at the papers, signatures, seals, official stamps, all real. Why me? I asked quietly. Because you showed up when nobody else did, he said. And because Harold finally understood that character builds companies, not bloodlines. I left the office with the file pressed to my chest. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the parking lot. The truth wasn't heavy. It was freeing, the kind of weight that lets you stand taller, not lower. When I got home, I placed the file next to the box and whispered, He really did trust me, didn't he? The lights flickered once more, not a glitch this time, but something closer to acknowledgement. The next morning started like any other lie, quiet, polished, and full of performance. Daniel was already dressed for work, standing by the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone, his tie perfectly aligned, his coffee untouched. The sunlight hit his wedding ring, the same one he hadn't taken off even when he started sleeping at the office. He looked up when I entered. We need to talk, he said, like he'd been waiting for an audience. I poured myself coffee first. About what? Us, he said flatly. It's not working anymore. I stirred the cup slowly, letting the spoon click against the ceramic. You mean your marriage? He exhaled through his nose, like I'd just interrupted his presentation. Claire, please don't make this dramatic. I'm trying to be honest. Honest, I repeated. Now that's new. His jaw tightened. This isn't about blame. It's just, Madison and I laughed. It came out sharper than I meant. You're really doing this here? Over coffee? He looked confused that I wasn't crying. I didn't plan for it to happen, he said, the most predictable sentence a cheating man could ever use. We just connected. You connected, I said. At work? In the company car? At your father's funeral? Don't do this, he warned. Do what? Speak English. He slammed his hand on the counter. You know what I mean. You've been cold for years. You care more about playing nurse to my father than being a wife. That hit differently, not because it was true, but because of how easily he said it. I took care of your father because someone had to, I said calmly. Because you were too busy polishing your image while he couldn't even walk on his own. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. He's gone now, Claire. We both need to move on. I looked at him, really looked the expensive watch, the perfect hair, the arrogance that came from being told he was the future of everything. Move on to what, Daniel? Your next PR opportunity? He grabbed his briefcase. I'm offering you dignity, he said. You can leave quietly, and we can handle the divorce privately. No drama. Privately? I echoed, taking a slow sip of coffee. Like your affair? His phone buzzed on the counter. The name Madison Cole flashed across the screen. The timing couldn't have been better. I slid the phone toward him. "She's punctual." He snatched it up, his face red. "You're not being reasonable." "Neither was your father when he gave you a company you didn't earn," I said. He blinked, thrown off balance. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said lightly. "Just something I heard." He straightened, defensive. "For your information, Dad trusted me with everything. He knew I could lead." I smiled thinly. "He also knew what kind of man you were." For a moment, the room went silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. He broke it first. "You need to leave by tonight. Madison's moving in." The coffee cup nearly slipped from my hand. "You're moving her into your father's house?" "Our house," he corrected. "Legally, it's mine. The paperwork went through last month." "Paperwork," I repeated. I remembered the folder he'd asked me to sign, the one with the caregiver acknowledgement clause. He thought he'd been clever. I set the cup down and nodded. "Fine." That threw him off again. "Fine?" "Yes. I'll pack my things." He waited, expecting a fight, maybe tears. He didn't get either. "Good," he said, adjusting his tie again like that, made him the adult in the room. "I knew you'd understand." I smiled, not the polite kind. The kind that comes from seeing a man dig his own grave while thanking you for the shovel. As he left for work, Madison was waiting in her car by the driveway. I watched from the window as she got out, handed him a folder, and kissed him like she'd already won something. He kissed her back. Then they walked toward the porch together, laughing. The image stayed burned in my mind, but it didn't hurt. Not like before. It just felt clarifying. I packed that afternoon. Only essentials: a few clothes, Harold's letter, the wooden box, and the file Alan gave me. Every folded shirt felt like closing a door. When I finished, I walked into Harold's study one last time. His photo still sat on the desk, next to an old mug that said, "Builders Build." I touched the frame and whispered, "You were right." Outside, the wind picked up. I loaded my suitcase into the car, locked the front door, and slid the key under the mat. The moment I stepped off the porch, a strange calm settled over me, the kind that comes when you stop begging life to be fair. I didn't know where I'd go yet. Maybe a hotel, maybe a friend's couch. But for the first time in months, every step away from that house felt like oxygen. As I pulled onto the road, I looked in the rearview mirror. Daniel and Madison stood on the porch, talking, laughing again. She pointed at the house with pride, and he put his arm around her shoulders. The scene was almost perfect, except for the fact that everything they were standing on no longer truly belonged to them. I drove on, no music, no tears. Just the low hum of the tires and the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows the story isn't over, not because of revenge, but because of justice still waiting its turn. The road curved, and the house disappeared from view. What replaced it was the city skyline in the distance, sharp, cold, and full of opportunities for the truth to find daylight. The office of Alan Rhodes looked exactly like the kind of place where truth hides until the right person knocks. No fancy building, no receptionist in designer clothes, just quiet confidence and the smell of old paper. When I walked in, Alan stood from his desk immediately. He was older than I remembered, gray hair, clean suit, kind eyes that seemed to know why I was there before I said a word. "Mrs. Bennet," he greeted, shaking my hand. "I'm sorry for your loss. And for what followed it." He didn't have to explain what it was. The humiliation. The affair. The betrayal dressed up as practicality. "I found the letter Harold left," I said, placing it on his desk. "He told me to bring you this file." Alan opened the box slowly, like it was sacred. Inside was the same file Harold had told me about, the one labeled Amendment Pending. He glanced over a few pages, nodded, then pulled open his bottom drawer. From it, he took out a thick envelope sealed in wax. "I was wondering when this would surface," he said. Harold was a man of his word. He broke the seal carefully, revealing several signed documents stamped and notarized. "This is Harold Bennett's final amendment to his estate," he explained. "Filed and certified 6 weeks before he passed." My stomach tightened. "What does it say?" Alan took his time, reading line by line before looking up. "It says you are the controlling shareholder of Bennett and Sons Developments, 51% ownership, full voting rights. I blinked, trying to understand. That can't be right. It's not only right, he said, sliding the document toward me. It's legally binding. Harold knew exactly what he was doing. I skimmed the pages. My name was printed clearly, followed by Harold's signature and 2 witnesses. The clause title read, Transfer of controlling interest to caretaker and executor of final estate. Alan continued, Your husband was under the impression that his father's previous will remained valid. It didn't. This one overrides it. I set the papers down. Why didn't Harold tell me? Alan smiled faintly. He said if he told you, you'd refuse it out of guilt. He wanted you to find out only when you were strong enough not to give it back. That sounded like Harold practical and stubborn. Alan leaned back in his chair. Claire, this isn't just about money or property. Harold didn't want his legacy in the hands of someone who treated people like numbers. He saw how Daniel was acting. The arrogance, the neglect. He knew this company would die under that kind of leadership. I nodded slowly. And he thought giving it to me would fix that? He thought giving it to someone who understood loyalty might save it. The room went quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock. I stared at the papers again, my name staring back like a challenge. I don't want a company, I finally said. Alan folded his hands. Then think of it as stewardship. You don't need to run it. You just need to make sure it survives under the right kind of leadership. I thought about Daniel, the man who replaced empathy with ambition, who threw me out of our home to make room for the woman who smiled at funerals. A part of me wanted to hand this back, to walk away and let the universe handle him. But then I remembered Harold's words. Don't fight with anger. Fight with patience. Alan's voice broke through my thoughts. Claire, I'll handle the legal filings quietly for now. Daniel doesn't know this exists, and it's best it stays that way until the estate reading. We'll let him reveal who he really is in public first. That plan felt right. Justice, not revenge. Before I left, Alan handed me a small envelope. Harold wrote you something else, he said. I opened it outside under the shade of an old oak tree. It was just one line, written in Harold's uneven script. When truth stands quietly, lies expose themselves. Hand pen. I folded the note and put it in my coat pocket. That afternoon, I drove past the Bennett & Sons headquarters downtown. Through the glass windows, I could see Daniel standing in front of a crowd, giving some corporate speech about innovation and vision. Madison was beside him, pretending to take notes while soaking up the attention. They looked untouchable. The kind of people who thought the world revolved around their ambition. I parked across the street and watched. The press cameras flashed, microphones pointed their way. Daniel smiled like the heir to a kingdom, while I sat in my car holding proof that the kingdom was already mine. But I didn't feel like celebrating. The power wasn't the victory, it was the silence, the knowing. Later that night, I went back to Harold's house. It was empty now, but it still felt like he was there. I made tea, sat in his study, and reread the amendment under a dim lamp. Each line felt heavier than the last, not because of what it gave me, but because of what it asked of me to carry the weight of doing the right thing. A faint sound interrupted the buzz of my phone. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Hey, he said casually, as if nothing had happened. Just checking if you're still at the house. Madison and I might stop by tomorrow to go over the property transfer. Sure, I said, keeping my voice calm. I'll make sure everything's ready. He sounded relieved. Good. I knew you'd be reasonable. Always have been, I said, and hung up. For a long time after, I just sat there, staring at Harold's framed quote on the wall. Integrity builds more than walls. I finally understood why Harold trusted me. It wasn't because I was his daughter-in-law. It was because I was the only person left who didn't want anything from him. The rain started again outside. I didn't mind it this time. The sound wasn't heavy, it was steady, deliberate, and patient, just like the truth. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Maybe it was the sound of the rain, or maybe it was the feeling that something had shifted inside me. I didn't feel sad anymore. I didn't even feel angry. Just steady, like the world had finally stopped spinning out of control. I made coffee and sat by the window, looking at the driveway where Daniel once parked his car. It hit me that this was the first time in years I didn't have to listen for the sound of his engine, didn't have to wonder what version of him would walk through the door that night, the charming husband or the cold executive. The phone buzzed. It was a message from Alan. Everything filed. Keep quiet until the will is read. Timing matters. I typed back, understood. That was all. After breakfast, I drove into town. I hadn't been to the city since Harold's funeral, and it was strange seeing his face on the company's tribute banners, honoring a legacy of excellence. Underneath the slogan, Daniel's name appeared as CEO. At the corner cafe, I ordered tea and opened my laptop. For an hour, I read everything I could about Bennett and Sons developments, quarterly reports, public statements, contracts. It didn't take long to spot the cracks. Projects delayed. Budgets overrun. Client retention dropping. Harold would have lost his mind seeing how badly his son was managing it all. A waitress brought my order. "You okay, Han? You look like you're planning a heist," she said with a grin. I smiled back. Something like that. When I left the cafe, I stopped at the florist next door. I bought white lilies, Harold's favorite. The woman behind the counter wrapped them neatly, saying, "Someone must have loved lilies as much as you do." "He did," I said, "and he still does." That night, I took the flowers to Harold's grave. The ground was soft from the rain. I knelt, brushed the dirt off the stone, and whispered, "I'm not angry anymore. You were right, patience hurts, but it works." I stayed there a long time, just breathing, before heading home. The next few days passed quietly, but I could feel the tension building under the surface. Not mine, Daniel's. He'd started calling more frequently, his tone sharper each time. "Why hasn't the house been listed yet?" he demanded one afternoon. "Because it's part of the estate," I said evenly. "That's my father's property, Claire." "Yes," I said. "It was." He hung up on me. That evening, Alan called again. "He's panicking," he said. "Let him. The board's watching him closely. He's making rash decisions." "What kind?" I asked. "He's spending company funds to cover debts from a side project, something about a new branch development. He's hiding it under marketing expenses." I exhaled slowly. "How bad?" "Bad enough that when it comes out, it'll look deliberate." I took a sip of tea, thinking it through. "So we let it come out." "Exactly," Alan said. "You don't have to move a muscle. Just keep your name clean and your mouth shut." For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control. It wasn't the kind that comes from power. It was the kind that comes from knowing you don't have to prove anything anymore. 2 days later, Daniel made his first public mistake. A press release went out announcing a $3 million strategic expansion to a non-existent property site. Within hours, investors started calling the office. Madison tried to do damage control, but her emails leaked, and they were bad. Alan forwarded one to me. "Don't worry. We'll move the funds before the audit. No one ever checks Harold's old accounts." The arrogance was almost poetic. Meanwhile, Daniel doubled down. He posted a video online, smiling for the cameras, saying the company was stronger than ever. The same night, Alan confirmed that the internal audit was officially underway. I didn't celebrate. I just turned off my phone, lit a candle, and sat at Harold's desk. On the corner of it, I'd left his note. "When truth stands quietly, lies expose themselves." It was happening exactly as he said. The next morning, I went to the grocery store. I didn't need anything in particular. I just wanted to see people who still lived normal lives. A woman in the produce aisle was talking loudly on her phone about the CEO scandal at Bennett and Sons. I paused near the apples, pretending to browse. She said, "Yeah, they say the audit's tearing the place apart. The mistress too, she's apparently involved." Her friend's voice came through the phone speaker. I knew that woman was trouble, always shows up overdressed for meetings. "Awal." I smiled slightly, choosing 2 apples and walking away. When I got home, I checked my email. There was a message from Daniel with the subject line, "Urgent." "Claire, don't get involved in company matters. Whatever you're doing, stop. It's not your concern." I replied with one sentence, "It's exactly my concern." That was all it took. The phone rang 2 minutes later. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, his voice trembling between anger and panic. You think you can hurt me with that lawyer? You signed the papers, Claire. The house, the assets, everything. You're out. I deleted it before it ended. Later that evening, I stood by the window again, watching the streetlights flicker on. Somewhere across town, Daniel was probably realizing what Harold had already known, that arrogance blinds faster than love ever could. The calm I felt wasn't vengeance. It was justice waiting for its cue. I turned off the lights, set Harold's amendment folder on the table, and whispered, "Now we wait." The night air was cool, the house steady and silent. It wasn't a war I was fighting anymore. It was balance being restored, one truth at a time. The morning the headlines broke, I was still in bed. My phone buzzed nonstop, texts, alerts, emails. I didn't need to open them to know what they were about. Daniel's name was trending. I finally reached for the phone and read the top article. Bennett and Sons CEO, under investigation for financial misconduct. The story laid it all out: the fake expansion project, the misused company funds, and the leaked emails between Daniel and Madison. The line that made me pause read, "Internal sources confirm documents from Harold Bennett's estate will determine the company's future leadership." It was out now, the quiet truth turning into noise. I made coffee and sat by the kitchen counter, scrolling through the article again. The reporters had done what I didn't have to: expose him. The audit findings, the false invoices, even the deleted messages, all of it was public record now. Alan called an hour later. "You've seen it?" he asked. "I have. They'll hold a press conference this afternoon. The board's calling an emergency meeting." "Will I need to be there?" "No," he said. "Not yet. The will reading is scheduled for tomorrow. Let the chaos breathe." That phrase made me smile. Let the chaos breathe. It sounded almost therapeutic. I turned on the TV. The news anchors spoke in that careful, rehearsed tone they use when describing a man's downfall without sounding too gleeful. Madison's photo appeared beside Daniel's, hers smug, his defensive. By noon, his calls started again. I ignored the first three, but on the fourth, curiosity won. "Claire," he said immediately. His voice cracked. "You have to help me. You still have contacts in the press, right? They're twisting everything." "Are they?" I asked calmly. "Of course. The audit isn't even complete. Madison," he stopped himself. "They're saying she's involved too. That's ridiculous." I said nothing. The silence made him nervous. "Claire, please. If this story keeps spreading, I could lose everything." I almost laughed. Everything the word men use when they finally realize they're not untouchable. "I told you," I said. "Truth doesn't need my help. It walks on its own." He exhaled hard, angry now. "You think you're so righteous? You walked away from this family. From me." "I walked away from a man who thought betrayal was leadership," I said. He was quiet for a long second. "You'll regret this." "No," I replied softly. "You will." Then I hung up. That afternoon, I met Alan downtown to review the estate papers. The boardroom was full of tension, executives whispering in corners, reporters camped outside, phones vibrating like alarms. Alan nodded toward the chaos. "They all want to know who controls the company now. They'll find out tomorrow." I looked through the glass wall and saw Daniel pacing near the elevators, red-faced, trying to talk his way through a call. Madison stood beside him, sunglasses on indoors, her lips pressed tight. Every so often, she glanced around like a child, realizing the game was over. Alan handed me a copy of the final schedule. "Tomorrow's reading will be public. Cameras allowed." Harold requested transparency. "Of course he did," I said. "He always believed sunlight was the best disinfectant." We left quietly, while the press swarmed Daniel. One reporter shouted, "Mr. Bennett, is it true your father transferred control to someone else?" He didn't answer. His silence was louder than any denial. That night, I stayed in Harold's house again. It felt right to be there, the walls steady, the air calm, the storm outside raging for someone else this time. I made tea and reread Harold's letter one more time, tracing the ink with my thumb. When truth stands quietly, lies expose themselves. I turned off the lights and let the quiet take over. By morning, the city was humming again, reporters outside Bennett headquarters, news vans parked along the curb. Alan met me by the entrance. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," I said. Inside, the boardroom was full. Daniel sat at the end of the table, shoulders stiff, Madison beside him. The directors whispered among themselves. Cameras flashed. The estate lawyer, a neutral voice, opened Harold's sealed envelope. Alan leaned in and whispered, "Remember, we don't react. Let them process it." The lawyer began reading the standard sections: assets, trusts, personal effects. Then he reached the amendment. His voice didn't shake, but the air did. Pursuant to the final amendment executed 6 weeks prior to Harold Bennett's passing, controlling interest in Bennett and Sons developments totaling 51% of company shares is hereby transferred to Mrs. Claire Bennett. You could have heard a pin drop. Daniel's face went blank, then flushed. Madison turned to him, whispering something that made him flinch. The directors looked between them, realization dawning like sunlight through fog. I didn't move, didn't smile. I just sat there, steady and silent, the living embodiment of Harold's lesson. The lawyer continued. Effective immediately, Mrs. Bennett will assume voting authority pending confirmation by the board. All decisions made under prior management are subject to review. Daniel finally stood up. "This is absurd," he shouted. "She's not even part of the company." Alan replied calmly, "She is now." The cameras caught everything: Daniel's outburst, the gasps, my stillness. He pointed at me, shaking. "You did this. You and that old man. You planned this from the start." I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, Daniel, you planned your own downfall. I just watched." The room went quiet again. Outside, reporters were already shouting questions. I walked past them without answering, Alan beside me. The flash of cameras followed, but I didn't flinch. When we reached the car, Alan said quietly, "You handled that perfectly." I looked out the window at the building behind us, the one Harold built, the one Daniel almost destroyed. "It wasn't revenge," I said. "It was correction." And for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but from finally being done pretending. The board's decision came faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours of the will reading, Daniel was suspended from all executive duties, pending investigation. The same men who used to laugh at his jokes now avoided eye contact. His voice, once loud in every meeting, was suddenly absent from the morning briefings. Alan called that night. "It's official. You're now interim chairwoman." The title sounded foreign on my tongue. "That was never the goal." I know, he said. "But Harold made it clear he wanted you to protect what he built, not profit from it." I looked out at the city skyline from the balcony. The building lights flickered in the rain, and somewhere out there, Daniel was realizing what power feels like when it slips away, not all at once, but piece by piece. The next morning, news outlets ran with the headline, "Bennett and Sons names widow as interim chairwoman amid scandal." They loved that word, scandal. It sold better than truth. I drove to the office for the first time since everything happened. The receptionist froze when she saw me, then quickly straightened her jacket. "Good morning, Mrs. Bennett," she said nervously. "Morning, Claire will do," I replied with a small smile. The elevator ride was quiet, just the hum of machinery and my own heartbeat. When the doors opened on the top floor, Daniel was already there waiting. He looked exhausted. His suit hung loose, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight. "So this is how it ends?" he said bitterly. "I didn't end it," I said. "You did." He let out a hollow laugh. "You think you're better than me? You think he gave you that power because you earned it?" I met his gaze steadily. "No. He gave it to me because I respected it." His eyes darkened. "Enjoy your little victory. You'll see the board will eat you alive." "Then I'll feed them the truth," I said, walking past him. Inside Harold's old office, everything looked the same. The framed blueprints, the mahogany desk, even the leather chair he loved. But the air felt different now. Not heavy, just honest. The day moved in slow motion. Reporters called. Lawyers arrived. Statements were drafted. I approved one. Bennett and Sons will continue to operate under Harold Bennett's founding values: integrity, responsibility, and respect. The company will cooperate fully with investigators. And from one. It was simple, but it said everything it needed to. By evening, Daniel's spiral accelerated. Madison was caught on camera, leaving their shared apartment, suitcases in hand. The internet dissected every frame, calling it the Mistress's quiet escape. Alan forwarded me the clip. "I assume you won't comment?" "Not a word," I said. "He can speak for himself now." And he did badly. That night, Daniel released a video trying to defend himself. He sat behind a desk, voice shaky, claiming he'd been misled by poor advice. It was the same tone he used every time he lied to me, calm on the surface, desperation underneath. The comments section didn't buy it. By the next morning, major investors froze their shares. Banks called in debts. The empire he'd built on image began to collapse in real time. I spent that day reviewing company finances with Alan and the internal auditors. We worked until late evening, uncovering transaction after transaction tied to Madison's consulting firm. Each discovery was another nail in the coffin. At one point, Alan leaned back, rubbing his temples. "He's done, Claire. There's no way out." I didn't celebrate. I just looked at the spreadsheet, the long list of numbers that told a story without needing words. "I don't want him ruined," I said quietly. "I just want the truth to stand." Alan nodded. "Then let's make sure it does." "How full?" Outside, rain poured again. It always seemed to rain when something ended. The next few days blurred into a storm of consequences. Daniel's resignation went public on Friday morning. By noon, Madison's firm was under IRS audit. By evening, reporters were camped outside his condo, shouting questions he didn't have the dignity to answer. But the story that stuck wasn't about money. It was about legacy. The Wall Street Journal ran an editorial titled, "The Quiet Woman Who Saved Her Husband's Empire from Himself." I never read it fully, just the first line. Sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's precision. That night, Daniel showed up at Harold's house. He didn't knock, just stood in the rain until I opened the door. His clothes were soaked, his voice almost gone. "Everything's gone," he said. "The board, the investors, Madison, all gone." I said nothing, letting him speak. "I thought I was doing what he wanted," he continued. "I thought success would make him proud." "Harold was proud of honesty," I said. "That's what you never understood." He stared at the floor. "Do you even care what happens to me?" I took a breath. "Once, yes. But now, I care about what you learn from it." He wiped his face, half rain, half tears. "You always win, don't you?" "No," I said softly. "I just stopped playing." End 6. He looked at me one last time before walking away, the sound of wet gravel fading under his steps. When the door closed, I didn't feel triumphant, just free. I went to Harold's study, lit the small lamp, and sat in the chair he used to occupy. The clock ticked steadily. On the desk lay his framed quote, "Integrity builds more than walls." I whispered, "You were right again." From the window, I could see Daniel's car disappearing down the long driveway, its headlights swallowed by darkness. The house grew quiet, and for the first time in years, it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was peace earned, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles in quietly and stays. The first letter arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by hand. I almost didn't open it. The envelope had Daniel's handwriting, neat, careful, like someone trying to look composed after losing everything. Inside, there was just one page. "I know you won't believe me, but I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to be enough." No excuses, no mention of Madison, no begging for forgiveness, just those few words. For a moment, I wondered if he'd finally learned the difference between regret and remorse. Then I folded the letter, placed it in the drawer of Harold's desk, and went back to work. Since the board officially reinstated the company's normal operations, my days had been full: meetings, restructuring plans, endless decisions. But every so often, someone would ask about Daniel, and I'd answer honestly, "He's figuring things out." It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't my responsibility anymore. That evening, Alan stopped by the house to drop off some documents. He looked tired but relieved. "The cleanup's nearly done," he said, loosening his tie. "Investors are calmer now. They trust you." "That's because they finally see numbers that make sense," I replied. He smiled. "Harold would be proud." I nodded. "Maybe, but I think he'd just be glad the building stopped burning." Alan laughed softly, then handed me another envelope. This came for you at the office. Same handwriting. Daniel again. I didn't open it right away. It sat on the kitchen counter while I made tea, while the rain started to fall, while the clock ticked past midnight. When I finally tore it open, the letter inside was longer this time. I saw the article. They called you the woman who saved my father's legacy. They're right. You did. I wish I could have been the kind of man who understood that before it was too late. Madison left. She took what was left of the money and moved to Florida. I don't blame her. People like her always run when the lights come on. You don't owe me a reply. I just wanted to say. I finally read Dad's last letter. I know why he trusted you. I just wish he could have seen me learn it. This time, I didn't feel anger. Just a quiet sadness for the man he could have been, and the life we might have had if truth had mattered to him earlier. I placed the second letter beside the first, in the same drawer. 2 confessions side by side, like ghosts that had finally stopped haunting me. The next morning, I walked through the company's newly renovated lobby. The staff greeted me with polite smiles, their voices steady again. The chaos had passed. The air felt lighter. Near the entrance, the old company motto was engraved into the marble wall. Integrity builds more than walls. I ran my fingers over the carved letters. They'd always been there, but for years they'd been invisible, buried under arrogance and pretense. Now they finally meant something again. That afternoon, a journalist from a business magazine came to interview me. She was young, eager, clearly expecting sound bites about resilience or revenge. "Mrs. Bennett," she asked, "if you could say one thing to your husband now, what would it be?" I thought for a moment. That sometimes losing everything is the only way some people ever learn what matters. She smiled, thinking I meant it poetically. I didn't. It was just the truth. After the interview, I drove to the farmhouse. Harold had left me the place Daniel once mocked. The air smelled like rain and wood smoke. The fields shimmered under the sunset, wild and quiet. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and looked around. The same old furniture, the same creaky floors. But now, it felt different, like it belonged to me, not as a relic of loss, but as a home rebuilt from silence. I made a fire and sat on the old couch, watching the flames dance. For the first time in years, my thoughts didn't circle around betrayal or justice or pain. They were still, like the air after a long storm. A soft knock echoed from the door. I opened it to find Daniel standing there. No umbrella, no car in sight, just him drenched, thinner, humbler. "I didn't think you'd answer," he said quietly. "I almost didn't." He nodded, looking at the ground. "I just wanted to return this." He handed me a small, weathered box, Harold's old pocket watch. The one Daniel once refused to carry because he said it belonged to the past. "He wanted you to have it," I said. "I wasn't ready then," he murmured. "Maybe I am now." End of chapter. For a moment, I saw the boy Harold must have once been proud of, before ego, before deceit. Then it was gone, replaced by the man who finally understood what loss truly meant. I took the watch gently. "Thank you." He looked at me, eyes full of something I couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe love, maybe both. "I'm sorry, Claire. Not because I lost everything, but because I made you carry the weight of who I was." The rain softened outside. "I hope you find peace, Daniel," I said. "Real peace, not the kind that comes from pretending." He nodded, tears mixing with rain, then turned and walked down the muddy path toward the road. He didn't look back. When I closed the door, I set the watch on the mantel beside Harold's photo. The ticking filled the quiet room, steady and calm. I sat back down, wrapped in the warm flicker of firelight, and for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't waiting for anything, not revenge, not redemption, not closure. Just life, as it was meant to be lived. Quietly, truthfully, and free. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the farmhouse windows, catching the dust in slow, graceful motion. It was the first truly quiet morning I'd had in years. No calls, no lawyers, no reporters, just the gentle hum of life finding its rhythm again. I made coffee, the kind Harold used to drink strong enough to wake a dead man, he'd joke. Sitting by the kitchen table, I looked out toward the fields, the grass heavy with dew, the the world still soft from last night's rain. The watch Daniel returned rested beside my cup, ticking steadily. It wasn't a reminder of him anymore. It was a reminder of survival. Later that week, I finalized the plans for the Harold Bennett Foundation. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was practical, like he would have wanted. The foundation would provide business mentorship for small-town entrepreneurs, people like Harold once was before the skyscrapers, before the noise. When I mentioned it to Alan, he smiled. "You're turning legacy into purpose." "Legacy doesn't mean statues or buildings," I said. "It means making sure someone else doesn't get crushed by greed." He nodded. "Then Harold's work isn't over. It's just changed hands." The following month, I was invited to speak at the foundation's launch. I stood on the modest stage inside the same conference hall where Daniel once hosted his self-congratulatory innovation summits. Funny how places change their meaning when truth finally moves in. There were no cameras this time, no stage smiles or glass trophies, just real people builders, teachers, nurses, small business owners, all listening as I began. "I was once married to a man who thought success meant control," I said. "He believed money could make him powerful, and that love could be managed like a balance sheet. But he forgot something important. Honor isn't inherited, it's earned. And when you trade it for pride, you lose everything that makes you human." The room was silent, but it wasn't heavy silence, it was reflective. I continued. "This foundation isn't about revenge or redemption, it's about restoration. Because sometimes, justice isn't a courtroom or a verdict, it's the quiet rebuilding that comes after the storm." When the applause came, it was soft but steady, like rain on a roof, the kind that means understanding, not spectacle. After the event, a woman in her 50s approached me. "I lost my husband's company to his own greed too," she said. "I didn't fight back because I thought silence made me weak." "Silence isn't weakness," I told her. "It's what gives truth room to grow." That evening, I drove back to the farmhouse, the sun setting behind me, casting gold across the fields. The house glowed faintly in the distance, a small light in the vast quiet. Inside, I placed a framed photo of Harold on the mantel, his smile, faint but wise, watching over the space. Next to it, I added the watch and the deed to the company, both symbols of the same lesson, that what's built on dignity can't be taken away, no matter how hard someone tries. As I tidied the shelves, I found Daniel's last letter again. I hadn't reread it since the night he brought back the watch. I opened it, not with sadness, but with clarity. "You once said love and respect were the same thing. I didn't believe you. Now I do. I lost both because I never learned the difference. I hope one day, when people hear my name, they remember that mistake and learn from it. If they do, maybe something good will come from what I destroyed." Emsos. I folded it neatly and tucked it behind Harold's photo, not to hide it, but to leave it where it belonged, between memory and lesson. Outside, a gentle wind moved through the trees. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my feet. The night sky stretched wide and endless, filled with quiet stars. Somewhere far away, maybe Daniel was starting over. Maybe he'd finally found the peace that power never gave him. For me, peace wasn't a new beginning. It was simply life without noise, the kind of life I'd once thought I'd lost forever. I leaned against the railing, closing my eyes, listening to the chorus of crickets and the slow ticking of the watch inside. Every sound felt earned, every breath a small victory. The world didn't owe me anything, and I didn't owe it an explanation. Justice had already been served, not through destruction, but through truth, through calm, through integrity. Before heading back inside, I whispered into the cool air. "You were right, Harold. The best revenge isn't revenge, it's peace." I poured one last cup of coffee and set it beside the ticking watch. The flame in the fireplace flickered low, warm and steady, just like the rhythm of the house. And as the night deepened, I smiled, not the smile of someone who won, but of someone who finally stopped fighting, because the storm had passed, and the silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was freedom. The days that followed were steady, quiet, and beautifully ordinary. That was new to me. For years, my life had been defined by reacting to lies, to betrayal, to chaos. but now the air felt lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. Every morning, I drove into town to oversee the Harold Bennett Foundation. We turned an old library into the headquarters, a place that smelled like ink, coffee, and second chances. The staff was small but dedicated, a handful of volunteers, 2 retired accountants, and a young woman named Lila, who reminded me of myself 10 years ago, sharp, compassionate, always fighting to be taken seriously. One afternoon, as we sorted through scholarship applications, Lila looked up from her desk and said, "Mrs. Bennett, do you ever miss your old life? The business, the parties, the noise?" I thought about it for a moment. "I miss the illusion," I said. The illusion that being surrounded by people meant I wasn't alone. But peace is quieter. It doesn't need an audience. She smiled thoughtfully. "I hope I find that someday." "You will," I said. "The trick is not waiting for someone else to give it to you." The foundation grew faster than I expected. Within months, we'd funded 5 small businesses, each owned by people who'd been overlooked by the same system Harold once fought to survive in. A mechanic shop run by a single father, a bakery run by 2 sisters who'd lost everything in a divorce, a local carpenter rebuilding his dream after bankruptcy. Every story felt familiar, like fragments of the life I'd once lived. During one of our community events, a local journalist approached me. "You've become somewhat of an icon, Mrs. Bennett," she said, "a symbol of dignity and quiet strength." I laughed softly. "That's generous. I'm just someone who decided not to let bitterness be my legacy." She raised her brow. "Would you ever speak publicly about what happened? About your husband? The scandal?" I shook my head. "No, that story's over. What matters now is what came after." That night, back at the farmhouse, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine and looked up at the stars. The air smelled of pine and distant rain. Somewhere beyond the trees, I could hear the faint sound of a church bell. On the small table beside me, the pocket watch ticked softly, still marking time as it always had. I found myself thinking about Harold, not as a man of business, but as a man who understood something most people never do, that wealth means nothing if your word means nothing. I remembered one of the last conversations we had before he passed. He'd said, "People spend their lives chasing things that die the moment they're gone. But truth, Claire, truth outlives us all." He was right. The next morning, I received an envelope addressed to the foundation. Inside was a handwritten note and a small check. The handwriting was unmistakable Daniel's. For the foundation, for what Dad believed in. I can't undo the past, but I can try to build something that matters. I stared at the note for a long time, not out of sentimentality, but out of quiet surprise. It wasn't an apology this time. It was action. I called Alan to ask what to do with it. "It's legitimate," he said. "The check cleared through a separate account. He must have sold the condo." "Then it goes where it belongs," I said. "Into the community fund." Alan hesitated. "You sure you don't want to send it back?" "No," I said. "Returning it would make it about pride. This isn't about that anymore." He nodded. "You've come a long way, Claire." Maybe I had. A few weeks later, the foundation held a small ceremony for its first scholarship recipients. We set up folding chairs under string lights behind the library. The air buzzed with laughter and music. Families hugged. Kids ran barefoot across the grass. And for the first time, I felt like life had come full circle, not through revenge or triumph, but through restoration. As I handed out the final award, an older man approached me. He was one of the carpenters the foundation had helped. His hands were rough, his smile genuine. "You don't know what this means to me," he said quietly. "My wife passed last year. I thought I was done. But now I wake up excited again." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "That's all Harold ever wanted to give people a reason to keep building." He nodded, eyes glistening. "He must have been a good man." "He was," I said softly, "and he believed in good people." When the event ended, the lights dimmed, and the crowd began to drift away. I stayed behind, looking at the empty chairs glowing under the faint moonlight. A quiet breeze moved through the trees, gentle and familiar, like a whisper of approval from somewhere unseen. Driving home, I passed the old company headquarters. The building stood tall and quiet now, its lights dimmed, the new management stable, disciplined, It wasn't mine anymore, not in the sense of ownership, but I felt a strange contentment knowing it survived. When I reached the farmhouse, I took one last look at the check Daniel had sent before filing it away in the foundation's records. For the first time, it didn't feel like a remnant of betrayal, it felt like closure. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I caught my reflection in the window. Not the woman who'd been broken, or the one who fought for justice, but someone who'd simply arrived where she was meant to be. The world outside was calm, the night thick with quiet grace. Somewhere out there, maybe Daniel was still searching for his peace. But for me, it had already been found not in victory, not in wealth, but in the simple rhythm of an honest life continuing forward. And as the clock ticked softly in the next room, I smiled at the thought. Harold's legacy had survived not in buildings, not in money, but in truth. And so had I. A few months later, spring arrived quietly. The trees around the farmhouse bloomed white, and the morning air smelled faintly of magnolia. Life had settled into something I hadn't known in years, a kind of calm that didn't need to be earned anymore. It just existed. Every Friday, I drove into the city to meet with the foundation team. We'd grown enough to hire more staff, and Lila now ran the mentorship program. Watching her lead reminded me of myself, the version of me that once believed kindness was weakness, before I learned that it could rebuild entire worlds. That morning, we hosted a workshop for women starting over after divorce or loss. I listened as they shared stories of betrayal, resilience, and quiet revenge that didn't destroy, but restored. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't prepare notes. I just told the truth. I used to think revenge meant making someone regret what they did to you, I said, my voice steady. But real revenge, it's peace. It's waking up and realizing you don't think about them anymore. The room fell silent. A few women nodded. One wiped her eyes. Pain teaches you who you are, I continued. It strips away the lies you once believed about love, loyalty, even yourself. And when all that's gone, what's left is something stronger, something honest. Oh? Afterward, one of the younger women came up to me and said, I thought I needed to destroy him to move on, but maybe I just need to stop letting him live in my head. I smiled. That's the moment you win. When the workshop ended, I stayed behind to help pack up. Lila handed me a folder of photos from our latest projects. These are incredible, she said. You've turned pain into purpose. Not pain, I corrected softly. Perspective. That night, I returned to the farmhouse. The sky was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across dark velvet. I poured a glass of wine and stepped onto the porch, watching the lights from town glimmer faintly on the horizon. Inside, Harold's photo hung above the mantel, framed beside the watch and the first foundation plaque. Beneath it, I'd added a simple inscription, Integrity builds more than walls, it builds peace. I stood there for a while, tracing the edge of the plaque with my fingers. Everything I'd been through had brought me here, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as someone finally whole. The phone buzzed on the table behind me. It was an email from Daniel. Subject: Thank you. Claire, I wanted you to know I've taken a teaching position at a community college in Asheville. Business ethics. Funny, right? I tell students the story of a man who thought he could control the world until he realized he didn't even control himself. I don't mention names, but they understand. I just wanted to say thank you. Not for forgiving me, but for not destroying me. You gave me the space to become better. I hope you're happy. You deserve to be. I read it twice, then closed the laptop. No tears, no rush of emotion, just quiet understanding. He had finally learned his lesson, even if it came too late to save us. Later, I took a walk to the edge of the field. The air was cool, and the grass whispered beneath my feet. Somewhere nearby, a barn owl called out low and distant, like the world exhaling. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel haunted by what had happened. The past wasn't something I wanted to erase anymore. It was something I carried differently now. Not as weight, but as proof that survival could be graceful. I thought about Harold, his patience, his faith in truth, his quiet strength. He'd seen what his son couldn't, and in his own way, he'd saved us both. When I returned inside, the clock on the mantel struck 9. I poured another glass of wine, sat by the window, and watched the moon rise above the trees. The reflection of the farmhouse lights shimmered faintly on the glass, warm and still. I picked up the pocket watch and turned it over in my hand. The back was engraved with a line I'd never noticed before. Time reveals character. Harold must have had it engraved years ago. Maybe it was meant for Daniel. Maybe for both of us. Either way, he was right. Time had revealed everything who Daniel truly was, and who I'd become because of it. I placed the watch back on the mantel, next to Harold's photo, and whispered, "We're okay now." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint sound of rain in the distance. I closed my eyes, and listened not for what was gone, but for what remained. Peace wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with victory speeches or headlines. It was the quiet hum of a life rebuilt, the laughter from the foundation's halls, the click of the watch, the soft crackle of the fire. And in that moment, I understood something I never had before. Justice isn't always about proving someone wrong. Sometimes, it's about proving to yourself that you were right to walk away. I smiled, leaning back into the chair as the firelight flickered across the room. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall steady, rhythmic, cleansing. The farmhouse creaked softly, as if exhaling with me, the sound of peace settling into every corner. No revenge, no noise, no anger, just quiet truth. And as the rain began to wash the world clean again, I whispered the words that closed every chapter of my life since that day. Forgiveness isn't letting them back in, it's letting yourself go free. If you found strength, hope, or even a little peace in my story, I'd love for you to stay with me here. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and tell me what part of this story stayed with you. Because healing, like truth, grows stronger when it's shared.